thanks very much, Omar and Sam and Woodrow and Noel and everyone else who's organised, conceived, and made today happen. Very quickly, I'm not a curator. It seems to always be said somewhere. Everyone ends up a curator one way or another. But, so I'll just open this presentation. Okay, so I'm going to talk for as long as it takes, really. I probably have more material than I need, and if I'm running out of time, I'll just cut the last bit of it. But what I want to do is to take the very useful theme that's been presented today, or the categories of the theme of documenting, rewriting, forgetting, and excavating, and maybe consider some examples of work from the context that I'm familiar with, the Northern Irish context, and think about how these terms resonate in relation to particular emphases and interests of recent art. The idea of a prequel symposium, I think, is an interesting one with respect to this broader theme of justice, and the idea of convening others together here with a future in mind, and it's a future, therefore, which is also about the past, about doing history with justice. So there's an interesting sense in which time is articulated here. We have an orientation towards the future. We're previewing. There's a prequel towards something, while our attention and our commitments, our allegiances that we're expressing are towards the past. So a sense of responsibility to the past in the context of an expectation or hope regarding what lies ahead. So the concern for history today is allied to, in the theme, to commitment to justice. And one way to begin to reflect on this sense of time in relation to justice is suggest a link to the way in which Jacques Derrida, in various writings, has thought of justice as allied to, analogous to, the principle of a democracy to come. Justice isn't necessarily the same as a democracy to come, this idea that we just constantly imagine or work towards a version of democracy which will be deferred, improved, altered, reviewed, and so on. But justice has a relation to this idea of the democracy to come. Justice is, in these ways, a condition of possibility, a possibility linked, in his terms, to a process of politicization. Justice is taking us towards politicization. Simon Critchley puts it, justice, in Derrida's understanding, is about opening up a future of political possibilities. The experience of justice, Critchley says, in relation to Derrida, propels one forward into politics. So there's maybe something interesting in the sense that we're in a prequel mode here, while we're also kind of trying to do justice to history. So these are sort of incidental, but maybe useful correspondences to cite as we proceed, as we move forward. Importantly, in those terms as well, no form or system in Derrida's thinking can fully embody justice. There's a need, he says, for a disembodiment of justice. So politics is guided without justice being fully present. Justice continually escapes the horizon of presence. In this sense, justice is, to use the central term of Derrida's thinking, it's about deconstruction. It's a kind of deconstruction. It's what makes deconstruction possible. It's the condition of possibility for deconstruction. So this is a separate, perhaps theoretical interest. But it's also allied then to another term in Derrida's thinking, which is that of the spectral, of something which is both bodied and disembodied, both in time and out of time, and so on. And maybe that's a connection we can draw out further. So the background to this talk then is really about the political and historical predicament of the post-Troubles era in Northern Ireland. And why I want to talk about that is because I guess I've been writing about it a little bit over recent years, but also these issues are very live in the Northern Ireland context. In 1998, there was the signing of the Good Friday Agreement, a multi-party consensus was reached around how the region would be governed. And in a way, this was a resolution of an awful lot of ongoing political problems, historical injustices, and so on. But it's something which has never, there hasn't been, full resolution. There hasn't been kind of completely settled modes of governance. It took until 2008 for the devolved institutions to fully begin to operate. But even last night, there was a bomb in Belfast city centre, only partially exploded, no one hurt, and so on. But we get the sense, of course, that these things, while we live in the post-Troubles era, or in the era of peace, that peace has also been something which has constantly been unsettled all the time. In a way, peace itself is something which is a curiously kind of uncanny state. Okay, so I'm reading from a screen here, so excuse me as I scroll and so on. So I want to talk then about that background in Northern Ireland in relation to some of these themes of documenting, rewriting, forgetting, and excavating. I want to talk about these in relation to particular artworks and maybe some contexts for artworks. But as I go forward with thinking about this, it made sense for me to consider these four themes backwards, to work on the prequel plan in reverse order. So what I'll do is I'll talk a little bit about something in relation to excavating, something in relation to forgetting, something in relation to rewriting, and if there's time, something in relation to documenting. So these four sections, as I bring them up, aren't fully synthesized. They point to four different things with the use of different artworks, but they capture a number of currents within this post-Troubles era of practice. Okay, so the first thing then will be excavating. And here's, first of all, an image from Willie W. 2007 Ghost Story. But the thing I want to refer to, first of all, is that in the new issue of the London Review of Books, there's an essay by the marvellous Northern Irish journalist and writer Susan McKay about the disappeared. The disappeared, of course, is a very traumatic issue in Irish, Northern Irish life, history and politics, about various people who were taken away and killed, explanations never given, the investigations never fully undertaken in relation to their disappearance, until recently when there's been a process of literal excavation in the landscape, as information has been given about where bodies are, and there has been large-scale digging up of parts of the earth to try and find these bodies. One of the key cases in this is the figure of Jean McConville, who was, as they call it, disappeared by the IRA in December 1972. There's a lot of stories which circulate about why the IRA chose to get rid of her, why the arguments they made about that, the case made by the family that she was of course completely innocent, and so on and so on. But the very recent part of this history is that in 1999, the House of Commons set up a commission, I'm quoting from Susan McKay here, set up a commission for the location of victims' remains, which offered immunity from prosecution to anyone providing information that could lead to the discovery of the bodies of 16 people who had disappeared during the Troubles. The family of Jean McConville were taken to a place eventually, were given information that their mother, Jean McConville, was buried in Templetown Beach in County Louth in the Irish Republic. Susan McKay writes that the McConvilles arrived at this remote and beautiful place to find hordes of journalists as well as the police and search teams. Over 50 days, hundreds of tons of sand were excavated. The McConvilles watched and waited, sometimes embarrassingly quarrelling in front of the camera. When the body of Eamon Malloy, another of the disappeared, was recovered elsewhere, Gerry Adams' response was that Malloy had been an informer. Gerry Adams, the president of Sinn Féin, had been an informer, someone who was reviled in all aspects of society on this island. The idea of the informer being, particularly reviled kind of person in the Republican tradition. So the search for Jean McConville's body, Susan McKay says, was called off. Eventually they found other bodies, they didn't find her body, but then it was resumed, and then it was abandoned. 4 years later, in 2003, there was further attempts to find the body, and members of the family were given information, and their mother was identified. And one of the children, Helen, said that stories that were circulating about her were nonsense. But when they found that the body of she had been shot in the back of the head. So there's a number of things which arise in this. There's an interesting way in which Susan McKay tells the story. She says this moment which sort of caught my attention, of how the family were embarrassingly quarrelling in front of the camera. It seems an awkward thing to say. It perhaps seems a little disrespectful to put this in the piece. But it's part of a story that she's telling, where there's one side of the story given, then another side of the story, then another side, another side. Not so much in a relativistic, parity of esteem of each of the sides, but in this constant sense of which is right, which is wrong. We can't get to the point of resolution with regards to it. She tells the story as well with regard to how public figures, leading politicians, are perceived in relation to this story, and the way in which Gerry Adams recently was interviewed on Irish television, quizzing him about his view in relation to his murder, and that there's a constant sense of denial in regard to his place within it, while everyone else around this situation is part of it. So a sense of truth and untruth, of visible and invisible, constantly coincide with Susan Adams' account of this material, plays that up really. So there's a sense here then in this account of a literal process of excavation, and there's an acute emphasis, and maybe a necessary emphasis, on contradiction, paradox, and an impossible resolution. There's something about the way this is written up that quite deliberately seems to keep it open. It doesn't advance a particular case, even as it's obviously sort of got a sense of ethical caution about the way it's written up. But there's a sense maybe as well that one of the other ways we can talk about this, that within the public sphere and how this is captured, there's a sense of ghosts that won't go away, spectres that haunt the conditions and the circumstances of progress in the present. Now, using the term ghost here is, it's an anachronistic kind of supernatural allusion, but it's useful in a specific sense. In that it's also something that's been taken up in the work of artists. The way in which the present is constantly haunted by a very disturbing sense of the past, and yet, however disturbing, there's a sense of a need to kind of, identify an allegiance to these turbulent, unresolved elements of the past. So this specific interest has been registered most particularly in the work of Willie Doherty, who notably also has been working with Susan McKay recently on a series of on a project about the excavations of around the disappeared around the Irish border. Doherty's work over the post-Troubles years has been drawn to all that haunts the present moment and the promise of progress. In films such as Ghost Story, which we'll look at a clip of in a moment, or Buried or Ancient Ground, there's an explicit effort to introduce images, narratives, atmospheres with strongly spectral associations in order to unsettle any stable perception of material and spatial reality. These are like films that look to disturb the ground of history, to kind of subvert a logic of linear historical development. Ghosts, as I said before, are figures out of time, and to skeptically subvert the rational normality of current conditions. What's more, Doherty's films and photographs are almost always concerned with old haunts, with repeat visits to places well known to the artist, to sites already well viewed in the artist's practice. He's got a stubborn commitment to constantly going over old ground, constantly looking again and again and again at the same places, while everyone else perhaps in the broader society would be urging us all to move on. So too then the work deals with the potentially uncanny effects on consciousness of the most familiar locations. Nicholas Royle writes of how it's impossible to conceive of the uncanny without a sense of ghostliness, a sense of strangeness, given to dissolving all assurances about the identity of a self. And in Doherty's work, most especially Ghost Story, a sense of subjective and spatial uncertainty is linked to the challenge of registering the significance of what has taken place at a time when specific historical novels one of the things that, of course, is obvious about Northern Ireland in recent years has been, lots of, development, lots of building, lots of, transformations of city spaces and so on. With that sense of promise and progress also comes the risk of obliterating
very, very happy
critical elements of the past.
To start the procedures of EVA International 2014.
Okay. So the particular points of the symbolic reference in Doherty are also useful in constructing a more general approach to reflecting on the art of Northern Ireland during this period. So considering the art that's appeared in the post-Troubles years, Jacques Derrida's comment that we must learn to live with ghosts is potentially relevant. This is a claim, first of all, and his claim, first of all, is a call for fidelity in politics to those who are not there, those who are no longer or who are not yet present or living, a commitment of anxious allegiance to the ghosts of our histories and our possible futures. Secondly, the insistence on living with ghosts implies a requirement in theory that we address the spectral element that haunts our knowledge of the world, but we might also think of the blind spots in our vision, and as such it necessitates attending to the contemporaneity with itself of the living present, and to that which secretly unhinges the present. So I'll show you this little clip from Ghost Story, if I can. So you get a sense of the kind of thing where Doherty's narrator, who's O'Neill, voiced by the actor Stephen Ray, is circling the edge of the city in a way, wandering over terrain vague at the edges of the city. This is prompts reflection on historical incidents, images of the past, and so on. Among the things which come up are memories of Bloody Sunday, the horrific set of events in 1972 when unarmed protesters in Derry City Centre were brought down by British troops. This has, of course, been the subject of inquiries and lots of personal trauma as much as public debate. It features in Doherty's film partly because Willie Doherty, as a 12-year-old, witnessed the events of that day, and it's influenced a good deal of his work since. But it's also something which has a major presence in the sort of public memory of Northern Ireland in a way that other artists have apprehended or engaged with as well. This brings us perhaps to our second consideration. I'm going to jump past other references to Willie Doherty just because I lost a bit of time there. Other works, Berry or Ancient Brian, for instance, which again are about the land, about excavation, about what may lie in the land, about what mentally, psychologically is buried, and so on. These are questions that the idea of thinking about this process of excavation takes us to our second point here. Only the second one now, and we're quite in time, so we'll see how we do. But the second point really about forgetting, about things that, and the questions and problems that arise with regard to remembering and forgetting in circumstances of post-conflict and of public and private trauma. There are important questions to be asked, of course, about how we remember and even perhaps about how we might learn to forget. Adam Phillips, in a little essay called The Forgetting Museum, writes about how forgetting, both in personal and political life, is hedged in by a kind of superstitious dread, a kind of useful way of putting it in the context of a discussion that alludes to ghosts. And yet, he says, forgetting has to be allowed for if memory, a kind of non-compliant or manufactured memory, is to have a chance. He cites Brian Friel, the Irish playwright, who has a character saying in his play Translations, to remember everything is a kind of madness. There's a need to find ways to kind of remember certain things, but also to forget other things. How do we proceed in a way that keeps us alert to the vitality of the past, honouring it, investigating it, reviewing our relation to it, while also being able to leave things behind? And ghost story is one useful point of reference with regard to this. But Doherty's work,
another example
is
that
consistently interested in this point of, that there's an impossibility of remembering. There's also an impossibility of forgetting. These are words that go round and round in a more recent film called Remains as well. That tension and contradiction is restated. But another example that proposes a different take on how Bloody Sunday and its aftermath are remembered or indeed forgotten took the form of a kind of participatory public artwork that was staged in the Irish Museum of Modern Art in 2008. This was the funeral of Patrick Ireland. For those of you who aren't familiar with Patrick Ireland is the alter ego taken by the Irish-American artist Brian O'Doherty after 1972, when post Bloody Sunday he decided that he would call himself Patrick Ireland in all art-related circumstances, in order that every time he showed his work, every time he appeared in a public context, that issue would have to be raised. That into that world, the story, the narrative and the memory of the Bloody Sunday incidents would have to arise again. It would constantly have to be revisited and restated. This was it was claimed by him that something along the lines of until the British military presence has left Ireland and all Irish citizens are granted equal rights, that he would maintain that denomination, that name, Patrick Ireland. But in 2008, 10 years after the signing of the Good Friday Agreement, when the vault institutions had begun to operate in Northern Ireland, Brian O'Doherty decided that
which was different from what he had done
had come to bury Patrick Ireland, that it was now important to move on. And what he did was he staged a funeral and an elaborate and public event at the Irish Museum of Modern Art, which was different from what he had done in the original moment in the 1970s, where he changed his name. There was a name change performance, so it was a kind of legalistic situation performed rather elaborately. His body was painted in different colours, colours of the Irish flag, in Patrick Ireland. But in the 2008 event, it was a funeral. A funeral was the form taken for him to both remember what the reasons for doing this, and also to begin to forget Patrick Ireland, both honouring him, laying him to rest, but also moving on. So the resulting funeral then was a kind of choreographed participatory performance involving numerous collaborators, beginning inside the museum, where a modest exhibition telling the story of Patrick Ireland was set out. The event then proceeded outdoors, when an unadorned casket containing an effigy of Patrick Ireland was carried by 6 other artists who had agreed to perform the role of pallbearers at the self-proclaimed celebration of peace in Northern Ireland. So an interesting idea that in 2008, 10 years after the agreement, we're celebrating peace in Northern Ireland, and we're celebrating peace in Northern Ireland at the Irish Museum of Modern Art in Dublin, which is a former military hospital, and we do this in the kind of formal gardens outside the hospital. And very, very few people, as I recall, from Northern Ireland there. So O'Doherty himself followed close behind with family and friends, moving slowly from the gallery space to the wide open area of the designated gravesite. In this grand setting of the former gardens of the Irish Museum of Modern Art, friends stepped forward to honour the commitment made by Brian O'Doherty, paying a tribute to Patrick Ireland, now that the once required political conditions were believed to have been met. The artist resolved not to use his birth name, he had said, and here's the quote, until such time as the British military presence is removed and all citizens are granted their civil rights. One thing that happened then, as part of this event, you can see the gathering here, was that the artist Alana O'Kelly was asked to contribute, and she began a long, really heart-wrenching keening, often surging cries of anguish and expressive release that cut through the relaxed decorum of the occasion. This was a really unsettling sound, and her voice rose up, and actually you can see in the background some of the kind of crass, excessive, unnecessary building developments that were going up around that time. And Alana O'Kelly's voice was reverberating off these structures, really, because of the amplification.
So this was a
had been provided. So it had this unintended effect of creating this quite extraordinary sound transformed by the actual physical conditions of the environment. Brian O'Doherty himself described the sound as nearly frightening, very primal.
And it was about welcoming.
So this was an interesting situation. There was an explicit intent and meaning, offering a clear message, a celebration of peace in Northern Ireland, as they put it. It was supposed to announce a recognised ending, and it was about welcoming the settling of Northern Irish life into a belated period of peace. Brian O'Doherty said, as Patrick Garland was laid to rest, "Thank you for the peace." These were the only words he offered to the gathered crowd.
Circumstances in Northern Ireland were not those of complete resolution or of political satisfaction.
If there was peace to be celebrated here, of course, but one of the other contexts for this is that the circumstances in Northern Ireland were not those of complete resolution or of entire political satisfaction, and O'Doherty's work was in this way potentially problematic. I want to skip over a little bit here. Okay, so in bringing the life of Patrick Ireland to a close, not with a revised name change, but with an emotive theatrical version of a complex social form, a funeral, O'Doherty offered a further response to the damaged society of Northern Ireland that appropriately prioritised the urgent need for public openness. That's one thing we could say. It was a public event, a crowd was gathered and invited, and there was a sense of a public celebration. That's maybe in a sense an interesting, positive thing. Yet at the same time, the specific form O'Doherty chose to both remember and forget raises other issues in a post-Troubles context. We might celebrate the characteristics of the event's actual occurrence, the way in which Alana O'Kelly's voice rising up in the circumstances creates this sort of chilling sense of anguish. We might see the use of this familiar ritual form, the funeral, to open up a new kind of sense of collectivity. But we might also question the wisdom of employing a funeral as the chosen form of symbolic articulation and collective engagement for a post-Trouble art situation. Susan McKay has noted in a chapter on commemoration in her book Bear in Mind He's Dead, which is itself a substantial memorial to the men and diverse victims of Trouble's violence, the Republican tradition is replete with stirring graveside orations, and the cult of the martyr has been a powerful engine for the armed struggle for centuries. Similarly, in their book Talking to the Dead, a study of Irish funerary traditions, Nina Witashek and Pat Sheeran describe Irish politics in terms of a cult of death, identifying a chronic cultural fixation on symbolic performances such as processions and funerals, which they suggest hardly encode a futurological orientation. When considered in light of this residual, quite macabre, maybe militaristic tendency, O'Doherty's well-meaning comment that we are burying hate, and one other thing he said, is rendered a little ironical in the sense of the way in which burials before have been used as part of the advancement of a militaristic rhetoric. So feasibly, all kinds of established and persuasive modes of staged public gesture are in some way contaminated by prejudicial previous use, but it remains reasonable to ask if a funeral as a symbolic framework can best provide the means for challenging pre-existing discursive alignments defining political issues and identities in Northern Ireland. So I'll skip another bit and then I'll move towards a very, very quick account of the two other things. So one thing that we might say that Patrick Ireland was trying to do in a way or Brian O'Doherty was trying to do here, is maybe to do away with ghosts and to kind of eliminate something of the spectrum. Frederick Jameson, writing about Derrida, writing about Karl Marx, and talks about how Derrida sees in Marx this idea that we need to get rid of ghosts, but Derrida says no, we need to stay with ghosts. We need to keep a certain spectrality in our thinking. And we need to keep open a sense of doubt and so on. So, okay. Okay, so two other things then, and I'll mention these more quickly. And maybe what I'll do is I'll just depart from the script for the last bit. I don't want to go everything up. So we have the funeral of Patrick Darling, which has given a sense of the problematics of remembering and forgetting, as also Willie Doherty's work in concentrating on excavating, in many cases literally, or more metaphorically in terms of thinking about how we dig into the layers of the past. And both of these are, in one way or another, commitments to an idea of the past and to its importance. Some other artists in recent years have chosen to take this commitment to the past on board in a way which involves revisiting existing documentary accounts, to address the historical material as it's found and to maybe reconfigure that in new ways, to kind of to almost rewrite the past under new circumstances. One artist that we might cite here, who's particularly engaged with the documentary accounts of the Troubles era, is the artist Duncan Campbell. Her work such as Bernadette from 2008 takes the character of Bernadette Devlin, who's a fiery, left-wing, Republican activist and politician, incredibly young and incredibly compelling as a public speaker, but whose particular version of politics and whose particular commitment to a class-based account of how progress should happen in Northern Ireland was gradually in a way marginalised by more mainstream politicians or by differently emphasised versions of progress. What Duncan Campbell does is he looks back to the moment in the late 1960s where Bernadette Devlin is, as I say, this kind of really dynamic public figure, and looks to try and think again about what's been lost or forgotten or what's undiscovered in her legacy. Now he does this in a way which is both a kind of exciting, super fast montage of the existing historical material, but he also then fictionalizes his relationship to this material in ways which are very interesting. Sorry about the quality of this image here, but you can see the way that in she was. I don't know whether many of you or all of you have seen Bernadette Devlin as a speaker, but as a young speaker, she was just extraordinarily passionate and articulate, to a kind of almost kind of preternatural degree. Just an ability to take on men much older than her and actually destroy them rhetorically. So Duncan Campbell's interested in this sort of the passion, the intellect, all of this that is represented by her at that time. But he does these curious things. So he takes some footage of her, and then he starts to kind of very close up look at her hands, for instance, or look at her hair, and starts to kind of try and approach a very, very different kind of analysis of who she was, something that's almost kind of inappropriately intimate. And then as the piece continues, the script which we begin to hear a woman's voice talking. This is a kind of Beckett-like exploration of subjectivity. Bernadette Devlin herself, having seen this film, apparently hated these last bits, where there's an investigation of how she might be thinking, but not in any realist kind of way, not in any kind of naturalistic sense of how to represent the past, but a very open, very speculative kind of undoing any sense of a stable presence. So Duncan Campbell's film really kind of takes this history, complicates it, introduces contradictions into it, and presents this vision of a public figure which is both something deeply private. She's very, she disappeared in a way from public view as someone who had that kind of original, didn't have that same kind of media potency that she once had. And Duncan Campbell's interested in investigating this. The very last thing that I'll mention then, and as I said, part from the script just so that I can cover this, these are other works by Duncan Campbell, Falls, Burns, Malone Fiddles, again, eccentric forms of documentary, scribbled and scrolled with drawings and so on, taking that original documentary footage and altering them with kind of willful, perverse interventions. there's a film called Make It New John from 2009, where he takes documentary accounts of the figure of John DeLorean, who invented the DeLorean car, which was being built in Belfast, argued for in some ways as a kind of solution to many economic problems in Belfast, this ridiculous sports car that provided lots and lots of jobs across the cultural divide in Belfast. But no one could buy these damn cars. They were too heavy to be sports cars, really. They were cheap, but, you know, absurd. No one could put them in their garage, drive into your garage in one of them with their, you know, doors that open at the side. You're locked in forever. But Duncan looks at the way in which the Northern Ireland story at this time was connected to a story about John DeLorean's entrepreneurial work in America, and to all kinds of other histories. So there's an extraordinary pluralizing of the history of Northern Ireland at that moment. And then again, as you can see in the final image in the bottom right, it enters into a fictional mode where there's a fictional account of a group of workers who are sitting in at the factory as the factory is about to be closed down and the DeLorean dream is over. So these are moments where the documentary history is again complicated, engaged with in a way which suggests this commitment to history, to what was possible at a particular point in time, but that departs into new career. The very last thing then, and I'll mention this just as a footnote really, is that the way in which certain artists have taken forms of documentary as the basis of their practice within this realm of kind of thinking about how we can stay committed to representing the history of conflict and conflict in its sort of live traumatic reality, while also undermining it. Someone like Phil Collins, who's become well known internationally in recent years, formed his work within the context of the peace process and the post-conflict moment in Northern Ireland during the 1990s. That was where he was educated, and that's where the kind of core of his practice began to be first articulated. And one of the things that he did was a project in 2002 called Holiday in Someone Else's Misery, which took as its subject the stories about troubled violence which weren't making it into the front pages of the major newspapers anymore, but he went to things like the local papers, the smaller newspapers, and pulled out how things like kind of shootings in marginal estates around cities were being captured there. But in addition to that, he got T-shirts made of these incidents of sectarian conflict, and asked people to buy the T-shirts as they were as tourist images of Belfast. And in a further gesture, he said that people could have the T-shirts free if they appeared in a picturing of the T-shirt buying process. So there's a kind of sense of that some of the anxieties around documentary, or some of the tensions around the representation of a post-conflict city that's trying to improve its image. Phil Collins was interested in making these more pronounced, bringing the difficulties to the surface rather than trying to eradicate them and create some kind of pure documentary account. Making the transactions around documentary, the priorities and the hierarchies within the newspaper were, make those the centre of the piece. Okay, so having skipped at great speed through that last bit, I think one of the things to mention is that with Phil Collins, that something like the contradictions of the documentary exercise are a vital part of the artistic proposition, and I think that applies to these other kinds of works. These are approaches to the topic, I think, differently of excavating, forgetting, rewriting, and documenting, that may be useful points of comparison as we go on. But I think there are also things that, in their different ways, propose ideas relevant to the idea of justice, ways of thinking about justice. Again, as Critchley puts it, there may be the types of work which are interested in opening up a future of political possibilities, much as they're engaged with the past. There are works which maybe propel us forward into politics in a moment of so-called peace, which can also be described as a kind of, in terms of sort of post-political predicament. These are artists who want what Chantal Mouffe would call a return of the political. Okay, well, maybe I'll leave that there. I think I've said more than enough and talked for way too long, so apologies. So thanks for now. I knew you would.
No, it's not.
Yeah. It's not allowed to begin with the words, but surely, you know, in that totally aggressive, hostile. Yeah. Okay, off you go.
Thanks, Declan. I wanted to pull out something you talked at the beginning about different perspectives that wasn't relativism, and I was thinking about that in one of my favourite quotes from Nietzsche: "We need more eyes, we need more affects. That will bring us to more objectivity." And then thinking about some of the different elements that you were talking about in relation to justice and forgetting. I suppose the Good Friday Agreement, some would argue, is a kind of great lie of, as what Declan McGonigal has said, in terms of normalisation. And a normalisation that involves in suspending those forces that might disrupt this progression towards a harmonious future. And I'm kind of interested in that sort of willful act of suspension, where different stories or those different voices that might lead to an enriched sense of objectivity are, well, I mean, the language, say, around this republicanism is one of criminality, of dehumanization, and so on, and to exclude from any intervention in legitimate public discourse or political discourse. Yeah. So I'm thinking about that, and then I was thinking about, you know, looking at Bernadette and the ways in terms of how do we arrive at this idea of justice or this ideal of peace, and the forms of silencing or being silenced that are continuously in operation. I mean, Bernadette, yeah, she was excluded, and there are lots of patriarchal reasons around that, but she was also shot. And just at the time that she become very vocal around the Good Friday Agreement, her daughter was arrested, extradited, and so on. And that certainly silenced her as well. So I'm kind of curious, you know, in terms of that backdrop, because it's almost as though sometimes I think with these ideas of justice, it's like a performative utterance or a statement or a theatrical suspension of belief, that if we say this often enough, then the reality, a new reality will emerge. And yet I wonder whether, even with those different artists that you brought in, those issues of silencing, of different forms of silence, of performativity in terms of statements, and also of this kind of willful suspension that we're in, if we could just hold it in this normalized state of being, which we know is a lie in some way, then somehow there'll be a shift towards ordinary forms of conviviality. So I'm just kind of curious about how you'd respond to those in relation to that broader question.
I hope this isn't an appropriate answer, but I mean, one of the things that I'm interested in is the way in which we might talk about again what Chantal Mouffe called radical democracy in a context like Northern Ireland. But the circumstances of the Good Friday Agreement are one of the staging of a very precarious consensus, which took a long time to deliver any kind of practical change and any kind of orderly governance. And yet, what it's based on is a very the declaration of sectarian affiliation. You know, a balance, a consensual balance between sectarian positions, which defines the politics in a way that is very exclusive. And one of the things that you want to ask about is how could different allegiances be named? How could people kind of present themselves all on different terms? That the way the government is balanced with its voting system is that there has to be this sense of kind of cross community consensus, and so it prioritizes that as the method of the way in which politics is done. Whereas other things like class or whatever else are somehow kind of deemed less relevant. And what we get then is something which is a very kind of neoliberal form of government done, even by parties like Sinn Féin or whatever, kind of corporatist and so on. So the thing about radical democracy is then, is in a situation like Northern Ireland where you've achieved a delicate balance and you've achieved careful, a kind of operating devolved governance, it seems perverse and it seems wrong-headed in some ways to argue for what, to use Mouffe's terms again, antagonism. We need more antagonism in Northern Ireland. We need Chantal Mouffe talks about the political as being that ineradicable dimension of antagonism which pervades any social order, every social order. And the thing that what happens within democracy normally is that the elements of antagonism are masked or they're obliterated in the face of a consensus. But in a situation like Northern Ireland, we still need that sense of the political, that thing that allows difference, alternative viewpoints, a sense of other options. We kind of need that to remain live in the situation, much as we need to be able to talk about the things that are no longer talked about. One of the really obvious things, particularly in relation to Belfast, is that there are more dividing peace lines in that city than there ever were during all the years of the Troubles. So that the problem in the city has been that in the centre of the city there's been a kind of an intensive commercialisation, an intensive interest in kind of creating it as a tourist city break destination, and then marginalising and pushing to the limits all of the things to do with sectarianism and so on. Put high walls between the communities and push them to the edges, and we concentrate on desecuritizing the centre of the city, and while there's still a vast sectarian geography at the margins. I'm kind of going round this here, but in a way, there's an obvious pragmatic thing of we need the politics to work, but then there's also the thing from, I suppose, the sense of artists, or the sense of thinkers advocating the idea that we need to pluralize the politics. We need to re-politicize, reintroduce the political into practical politics there. And it's kind of an answer, but I'm conscious you were involved in, say, the project with Jonathan Cummins, working with the viewpoint of dissident Republicans, people who do not accept the Good Friday Agreement. And this is really a series of films which are really difficult to watch, because you have people who don't accept the current conditions of peace. And yet to listen to this is to be awakened to something which is kind of necessary, this sense of the repressed underside to an awful lot of what is presented as peace. I'm not sure I could keep waffling on like this, but I'm probably only a quarter of the way to answering your question.
That's great. And I think, just on that, I think the interesting question is, can one be against Good Friday but be for peace? What would be the conditions?
Yeah.
Because the two of them are equated with each other at the moment.
Yeah.
So, and that political space needs to be opened up as well.
Yeah. And these are really, really difficult questions, and I think no one would want to be glib about kind of saying that peace is bad. I mean, that's not really what we would be saying, or that the Good Friday Agreement is problematic. I mean, it is, but obviously less people are dying than before, which is a good thing.
Thanks very much, Declan. First of all, I just wanted to mention something about the DeLorean.
Yeah. Which I know you've worked on. Yes.
Yeah, and it's just friends of mine who own the cars. The story about the doors opening when it parks. It's not the case. You can still get out of the car. So, again, I wouldn't want to put anyone off buying one of those buying machines from John Murray. So, I just had wanted to ask a little bit about when you're talking about that idea of antagonism, and I suppose that a lot of the current discourse around it really values this idea of the outsider, someone coming from the outside to that situation. And just thinking about that in Northern Ireland, and I mean, my cursory knowledge is thinking a lot about Joseph Beuys coming to Belfast, Jimmy Durham coming to Derry in 1988, that notion in Brian Field's translations when the map makers come from afar as well. And a work that I'm not overtly familiar with, but I would like to hear you maybe say something about, was Jesse Jones's work earlier this year in Derry, connecting Northern Ireland and Korea. And for me from afar, I thought it was an incredible piece of work. You were probably a lot closer to that, were you?
Yeah, well, I saw the piece, and there was a talk in Derry on at the opening of Jesse Jones' piece, which is a film which takes the transcript of an encounter therapy group from early 1970s Belfast, and dealing with sectarian issues and trauma around the Troubles, and it stages this in Korea. and with a group of Korean actors. And there's an extraordinary sort of alienation effect as we see this. And one of the commentators who was there on the day of that series of presentations about this was Eamon McCann, who's this man here, journalist Eamon McCann, who talked about how Jesse Jones's work, The Other North, with this engagement with politics in Northern Ireland was so different to him for things like the murals and so on that decorate the cities and the estates of these cities in Belfast and Derry and elsewhere, which are didactic and propagandist and so on. And he said that the essential kind of work that's being done is by people like Jesse, who kind of completely change how we address these circumstances, and that there's a sense of use of documentary material, engagement with history, but a complete replacing of that and redirecting of it in a way which is radical and jolting, and defamiliarizing. And I found it a very moving piece, actually, really simple terms, just actually hearing these things about Northern Ireland talked about, in Korean, in completely different circumstances, exceptionally powerful in the way it flipped and partly because Korea, of course, is a very charged, has a very charged idea of what the North means there, as compared to what the North means for Jesse Jones, a Dubliner thinking about politics in the North here. So there were clever connections, but it was a very rich project, very powerful piece.
That's really nice to hear. Thanks.
I guess we're probably up against it time-wise, are we? Not trying to get out of questions.
That's a very simple question to each. I haven't been inspired into any thought by the samples that you showed on the screen. So I'm a bit concerned about what artists are doing anyway. How politically astute are they in their actions, and are they more misleading than sometimes? And this one, just a simple question, is the one about the artist who did some work on Bernadette, Duncan Campbell.
Yeah.
Sometime last year, there was documentary film shown on Tissue Capper and elsewhere about Bernadette Marquisky. And the deepest thing that I picked up from that, apart from the political approach to resolution or non-resolution in the North, was her consistency, her complete consistency as an individual all through her life, from the moment she was politically active until this very moment as she's working on in the community where she lives now. And the artist, you just mentioned recently that he showed her life, and then he showed a jumble of confusion and contradictions in her thought, and he was inventing this.
Yeah.
So, can you explain that one?
Yeah. I'll just read a little. Okay. One of the things that Duncan is trying to do is a declared responsibility on his part to try and know her better. Right? So it's the perspective of the artist trying to kind of engage with the historical material, trying to kind of declare a commitment and a fascination with that moment in history, but also kind of understanding that it's not possible for him, or indeed for any of us, to completely know her motives. However much one documentary might demonstrate the consistency of her thought, that's also something which is a very kind of carefully articulated, coherent vision, and something endorsed by her as a presentation of what she was. Campbell is trying to kind of suggest that her place in history is perhaps more indeterminate than that, or unresolved than that, and maybe it's actually in that there's something in that. Campbell's thing, there's the last lines of the film are spoken by an actress performing a monologue written by a man seeking to locate the objective meaning of events occurring before his birth, with the conclusions he discovered, if any, distorted by being pushed through what's available in the media. I'm quoting here. The last lines we hear Bernadette, the character version of Bernadette, speak are, a voice not your own, you don't know. And writer Martin Herbert says it never really is your own voice, and you never really do. So it's the question being raised here isn't so much about whether we could create a coherent vision of Bernadette Devlin's politics and life. It's about the difficulty of an artist trying to kind of relate to the historical past without being dogmatic, without presenting something which is didactic or propagandist. It's to kind of create something which is much more open. The other thing to mention is that in terms of the things that I represent, I'm not showing artworks here. I'm not showing a series of photographs or anything like that. That these are, pieces of work of a particular length that are shown under certain circumstances. Obviously, the kind of thing that I'm presenting here about Bernadette doesn't give any sense at all of the type of artwork this is, which is partly very fast-moving and partly very strange. It's something which is quite disorientating, something which is not like documentary, but it draws from documentary. Similarly, the Willie Doherty work, which is, intended not for showing in a cinema setting, but in a gallery setting, is something which, has a particular kind of effective, set of stimulants, that it has a kind of queasy feeling to it through the use of the Steadicam and so on. So these things are made for other circumstances. They have a particular duration and they have particular effects under those circumstances. The thing about Brian O'Doherty's work, I think that's certainly a work which I think is very, very problematic and is the opposite in a way of doing something which inspires further thought. I think it's really kind of killing that, to use an unfortunate metaphor. But the Phil Collins work is something which is is public, participatory, all involved around, based on the anxieties of these transactions, particularly about you get your free T-shirt if you appear as part of this selling of Trouble's images. So I can see how you wouldn't get a lot from them here. I also raced through them far too quickly as well, so apologies for that.
And I mean it more as something that artists should be aware of rather than, sorry, I don't know what you want.
Yeah. But I do think that there's definitely an interest on the part of a lot of these artists to resist a kind of didactic approach and to try and create something which offers the possibility of these kinds of plural perspectives that Ashley mentioned as well.
And it can be an instinct to be contrary rather than thinking about yourself.
Oh, perhaps, yeah. Are we okay? Do you want to wrap that up there? Or?
Can I just say something?
Yeah.
I just think that the whole point of this is about this whole idea of reevaluating, recontextualizing, looking at past narratives, and I think there's so much material in there for us to examine. Sorry, I was just saying that you just brought up that you couldn't relate to something. I'm not quite sure exactly what your point was, but I just felt like it's very vital to look at these possibly lost narratives and the whole process of recontextualizing, re-examining, repositioning ourselves in the creative process. I think that's so vital to what is happening now in the world in lots of places. And for me, it's fabulous to kind of open up these possibilities and then looking. It's not necessarily about finding a certain direction. It's like re-examining what there is and looking at possible tracks for the future.
No, that's really useful. One final thing I'll just say actually is I'm conscious that the artists I picked were all men, and it was really just around the particular focus of the kind of work they were making. But I think had I done this again, I would have wanted to kind of open up. When you mentioned the sort of patriarchal way in which Bernadette Devlin also kind of, lost her place in politics in some ways, I would have liked to maybe open that up further as well. So I think that's another dialogue that's useful in these circumstances.
I just wanted to offer you a little quote before you go back to your seat. Just because what you said and the work you've presented for me had many resonances with other contexts. For instance, we will watch Leila Kilani. She's not able to be with us today, but she's apparently managed to upload her film to some website and we'll be able to download it and watch it later. Our Forbidden Places, which is a film that has to do with it wasn't called the Truth and Reconciliation, it was called the Equity and Reconciliation Commission that happened in Morocco a number of years ago. And there are issues in it with excavating, finding the bodies of political prisoners that had been disappeared under the reign of the former king. It also made me think of the Lebanese context. You mentioned Wali Ra'ad, who was a master of the uncanny in his own way. And one of his references is a Lebanese thinker called Jalal Tufik, who's been writing a lot about ruins and ghosts and what do you do in the wake of a civil war, or what he calls a surpassing disaster. And in terms of what you said about Derrida and his insistence on spectrality, maintaining a certain kind, not getting rid of ghosts, but maintaining that kind of indecision or spectrality in our thinking. Jalal Tufik, in one of his books called Vampires, an uneasy essay on the undead in film, I'm just going to collate together two little quotes. He talks about this idea of the documentary and of the fact that documentary has to be complemented by fiction in a way, unsettling those genres in a way much similar to some of the things that you pointed at. And he says there has to be a relay between documentary and fiction whenever dealing with ruins, and for him ruins are related to the idea of ghosts, or fiction has to reveal to us the anomalous labyrinthine space-time of ruins, and in case no ruins subsist for the ghost to appear, to supplement reality, so fiction has to supplement reality as a site of return of the revenant. In post-war countries, fiction is too serious a matter to be left to imaginative people, so to speak. And I won't give the second quote, but he ends it in saying, "I write in part so that the dead would not be withheld the right of return."
Yeah, that's really helpful, wonderful quote. When Wali Ra'ad did come to NCD to give his talk, he actually talked about Jalal Tufik. That was the subject of his lecture, so it's kind of great to hear that material coming up again. It seems really extraordinary stuff. Okay, I guess I'll finish up. Thanks very much. Thank you.